Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
And as the voice of my producer, Mr. Race Hobbs, says, this is Peter Robbins, and the show is Meanwhile here on Earth. You're listening or watching on KUNX Digital Broadcasting. You can also find us audio of this show going back for years on Spreaker and other various platforms. No monologue tonight. I'd like to devote a little extra time to the introduction to this particular guest and not have to speak fast to save that time that I would have spent on a monologue. My guest today is Reverend Michael J.S. Carter, and he is originally from Baltimore, Maryland. Michael moved to New York City in 1980 and lived there for 27 years, working as a professional actor before moving on to Ashland, North Carolina. Michael is an ordained interfaith minister and received his BA degree in letters from the College of New Rochelle, where he graduated cum laude. He received his Masters in Divinity Degree from Union Theological Seminary in New York City, class of 2000. He has served as a staff chaplain, board certified, at Lenox Hill Hospital, Beth Israel Hospital, Beth Israel Cancer Center, Methodist Hospital, and New York Hospital in Queens, while residing in New York City. While serving various Unitarian Universalist congregations in New York, Michael was trained as an anti-racism trainer and has been recognized by President Clinton for his efforts. Michael is also a weekly columnist for the Asheville Citizen-Times and has written articles for the Black Mountain News and the Tryon Daily Bulletin, both local North Carolina newspapers. A longtime UFO contactee, his book, Alien Scriptures, Extraterrestrials in the Holy Bible, was number one on Amazon.com's list of UFO-related books only about 10 years ago. Michael has appeared on George Norrie's Coast to Coast radio show and on George's TV show Beyond Belief, on Gaia Television as well. He has also appeared as a regular guest on Midnight in the Desert with Heather Wade, who took over that legendary show from Art Bell, and has been a guest on Academy Award-winning, very timely, actress Shirley MacLaine's radio show, as well as distinguished author Whitley Strieber's radio show, Unknown Country, in this, broadcast on this network. Reverend Carter has written articles on the UFO topic and religion for such prominent UFO publications as UFO Magazine, Alien Encounters, a British publication, the MUFON UFO Journal, Contact Forum, the Space Contact Encounters, SPACE being an acronym for Support Programs for Abductees, which is a UFO experiencer support group in New York City. He's also spoken at various UFO conferences around the country, such as the Second Philadelphia Need to Know Conference, the annual Long Island UFO Conference, and the late Bud Hopkins Intruders Foundation events. He has appeared on many radio shows, many television shows, and many documentaries here and abroad as well. But a few others do deserve recognition here. The History Channel's Ancient Alien series, and I believe Michael has just completed 2 new episodes, which he can tell us about. At Japanese television, the show UFOs in the Bible, The Real 440, and History Channel's Ancient Aliens, the Abduction Diaries, and let's see, right. Author Whitley Strieber calls Reverend Carter's first book, Alien Scriptures, Extraterrestrials in the Bible, the best book ever written on the topic. Michael's other books are A New World, If You Can Take It, God, Extraterrestrials, and the Evolution of Human Consciousness, God Consciousness, a 30-day meditation manual for God-conscious thinking, and The Metaphysics of Spiritual Healing and the Power of Affirmative Prayer. His newest book, Enlightenment, was just published in December and is a collection of his sermons. You can find all these books on Amazon books as well as barnesandnoble.com, but whenever possible, order from your local bookstore. They need the business more. Michael is on the advisory board of the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters, also known as FREE. He also continues to serve as a minister for the Unitarian Universalist congregation. And Michael, I was going to ask you about the pronunciation of this before we went on the air, and of course forgot. Swannanoa Valley Universalist congregation located in the beautiful mountains of western North Carolina. He also serves as a consulting minister for the Thermal Belt Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Tryon, North Carolina. And Reverend Michael Carter, welcome back to Meanwhle here on Earth.
You did wonderfully. Thank you. I should have edited that even more. I have a shorter one, an edited one. I have to send you next time. It's my pleasure, Peter. It's always a pleasure to be here and to see your lovely face.
And vice versa, and back at you. I know we've both been busy.
Oh.
We stay in wonderfully irregular touch here and the world of social networking, but you haven't been back to the show since 2022.
Yeah.
And even though the times they are changing, they have changed even more in the last 2 years since we've seen each other.
I know. It seems like the more it changes, the more it stays the same. I know that sounds cliche, but it certainly does. But it's always time well spent.
The a driving point in this show for me has always been, how do my guests become the people they became? And in many ways, again, it's something that really started occurring to me as a kid, as you begin to get that sense of people in what we'll call public life, whether or not we're first introduced to them as actors or sports figures, writers, or figures in major media, or local politicians, what have you. How did they become themselves?
Yeah.
And in asking that question, it's been really one of the most moving and completely interesting parts of doing a show like this, as well as altering with panel discussions and the like. But I know you were born in Baltimore. Can you tell us a little bit about your family life and the things you dreamt of early on?
Oh, sure. Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, I was born in Baltimore, born and raised in Baltimore. My parents worked for the government. My dad, my stepdad who raised me, was in telecommunications. My mom was a stenographer. They were both in the military. And we were raised in Baltimore's inner city. And then as my parents moved up in their employment, we were like kind of Jeffersons. We moved on up. And so those were my formative years. I suffered, as we talked a little bit before, from asthma as a child. And so had some hairy times then. And that played a big part of my life, my health. And I'm sure for them, it was very scary at times. And I was an avid reader. I got that from my mom. I mean, I just read voraciously, even to this day. My dad was the mathematician. He was very into, he worked with his hands. Even he was a supervisor. He was in the Air Force stationed in Germany, but he was a military person for a while. And he made, when he got out of the military, he just stayed in government work. I was athletic, believe it or not, with all the asthma as a child. I was very religious because my parents were very, very religious.
Can we stop there for a moment?
Yes.
I don't want to ever assume anything.
Yeah.
What religious tradition did you grow up in, and how did it manifest itself in terms of your family life as a kid?
Well, I grew up in the African American Baptist tradition. And, like any child, part of it was I wanted to please my parents, but I actually enjoyed going to church. And I branched out. I wound up being an acolyte in a Lutheran church, very good friends with the minister there and his son, Paul Whitson, and I was just comfortable in houses of worship. We can go into what that meant, but that's all I knew. And I knew that I was going to be a minister.
Really?
I knew that.
From
Yes,
what age?
Give
or take.
I would say 11 or 12.
Wow.
I did. I just loved it. I could recite chapter and verse. And, and as I got older, at one time I wanted to be into therapy. I wanted to be a therapist, but that is like the secular priest.
It's a function also of being a minister.
Yes, it is. But I stuck with it. I was in the theater. I get a modest pension. I was in the unions, Equity, SAG, and AFTRA, and like I said, I get a modest pension. But I left. I just, I wanted something else. I wanted to serve. And I probably got that from my parents. Just the importance of that, the importance of looking at people for who they are. I came up in a very social conscious environment as far as looking at people, race, creed, color, sexuality. My parents, none of that mattered to them, even though they grew up in a time of American apartheid. But, so they passed that on to us and they lived it. We had friends from all races and creeds and, gay friends. My mom had many gay friends. It was just natural. And I to this day, I thank them for that. We had other dysfunctions in the family, but that was not one of them. So
Michael,
that's how I grew up.
You had siblings?
Yes, I had a younger brother. We had different dads, but we had the same mom. He was murdered back in 1995, July 15th. Someone robbed him while he was driving. This was before Ubers. He was driving his car. They used to call them hacks, where a lot of people making extra money, they would use their own cars and they give people rides and, get some money. Yes. And he was killed. And I have from my biological dad, who I didn't meet until later, he's gone now. I have a half brother and two half sisters. They're on Staten Island.
Michael, can we stay here for a moment?
Yeah.
How old were you when your brother was murdered?
Okay, we were 3 years apart. He was 33. I was 36.
You were at that time a professional actor, or your life was in the church already?
I had feet in both worlds, but yeah, I was moving out, and I was going to school. I was going to New Rochelle, and I was still doing like background work, day player here, that kind of stuff to supplement. But yeah.
How did you deal with that, Michael?
It was tough. Because the odds are, what are the they're like 1 in several million that you would be murdered. A person would be murdered. It does happen, obviously, and it was very difficult. And you go through what could I have done? What could I have, but he made choices. And he was just in the wrong place at the wrong. It was a dangerous job.
Yeah.
And he needed the extra money. And his luck ran out. And it was tough.
More or less philosophical question for you here. Mm-hmm. As a person of faith, as a minister, as someone who believes in God, when something like this happens, a tragedy that just happens, We call them accidents,
Yeah.
for lack of a better word, but folks often take one of two points of view on it. One, it's part of God's infinite plan, which is so complex that we mere mortals can't understand, but
Mhm.
it's part of his plan, and you'll get faith from it, or
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
or the deist point of view, more or less, for me, of an divine spark set things in motion,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
things evolved around that,
Yeah.
and God rested on the seventh day, allegorically, or actually, depending on your point of view. And
Yes.
from that point, there are those who feel that God is the micromanager, that every
Yeah.
small grain of dust floating through your room and mine among the zillions that we have in our rooms, that's, on his scope.
Oh,
As
yeah.
opposed
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
shit happens. There is a
Yes.
randomness to the universe.
Yes.
It makes no sense, but it doesn't have to
Yeah.
do with good, bad, right, or wrong. It's just
That's where I am, which is probably why I'm not a Baptist minister anymore. I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister. No, no, because my idea. I mean, I'm a heretic to traditional, Orthodox religion, and I don't believe in this man up in the sky like Santa Claus pulling strings. I don't know what it is. I just believe there's something greater than me. Sometimes God, it's a lot of baggage. It's the source. It's the intelligence, whatever, and that we are there, and things do happen in life, and we are in charge of our lives to a greater degree than traditional religion would allow it. My brother made choices, and some of those choices were not the best choices,
yeah.
and this is what happened. And so, I don't want to insult people who still have this other view, but I can't blame this on God. Um, Kevin was in the wrong place at the wrong time. People had told him this was a dangerous job. Maybe he could find another way to make ends meet, and he made a choice. And so I don't subscribe that to any God. Um, this notion that there is life after life, and I look at that from a more scientific perspective. Energy can't be created or destroyed. So I look at it that way, but I don't look at it as there is a heaven or hell and there's punishment, and that I had to leave behind. And it works for some people. I respect that, but it doesn't work for me. And I miss him. I believe at some point our spirits will come together again, because I believe there is a source. Plato talked about a fractalated universe, and we come
That's
from
right.
this intelligence and we go back.
Yeah.
But that's about as far as my theology will let me go with that, and still
Michael,
keep my integrity.
um, it occurs to me that, how can I say, just completely lost that train of thought. Just before moving on, no, actually, what it was not long after my sister Helen died very suddenly, more than 20 years ago.
Mhm.
I was out having lunch with a good friend who happens to be my literary agent, now retired, and over a really nice lunch at Sardi's, where we often would
Ooh,
dine.
lovely. I
His
remember.
office is right in the building next door. In fact, that building that dominates that point in Times Square with the big
Yes.
clock with the globe on it.
Yes.
As the Paramount Pictures New York headquarters in 1922, when a lot of the film industry was settled here. But it was also the model that the artist who created Superman used for the Daily Planet.
With the Daily Planet. Yes.
And he had his
Yes.
offices up at the top. I'm off on a tangent here, but we were having lunch, and he said something to me, I'll share with you and our audience, which is, I know this is the worst point in your life, that you're in despair, that everything just seems empty and sad, but there will come a time,
Mhm.
whenever it comes, when the something about losing your sister, it will come back to you in a good way. And I remember sitting across the table from him, and I love the guy, um, and keeping a neutral expression on my face, but I was all those things at that moment, and thinking to myself something like, "I love you, but how dare you
Mhm.
suggest that anything in any way positive could come from
Yeah.
losing this dear person?" And months later, as I had worked my way out of despair to depression, then just kind of being in a funk and continuing climbing out of that bomb crater, I remember going down to the platform to catch a subway in a hurry, and I missed it as close as you can miss it when those doors close. And your normal reaction is that momentary. And at
Yeah.
that moment, I kind of went, that's not so bad. Wait a minute. And I started to notice that small things that used to irritate me
Hmm.
no longer did.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
big things that used to really piss me off, often, if I'd simply say, "Ah, this is nothing compared to something."
Yes.
And
Yes.
you know what? It was, a subtle but important change for me, and a
Yeah.
good one.
And it's and one of the positive things about healthy religion, and even healthy philosophy. I'm thinking of Buddhism, but I look at Buddhism more as a philosophy than a religion per se. But they talk about what Dr. King talked about. But there's suffering. There's something about suffering that if you can stay open to it, it helps you to, well, it matures you, but it helps you to prioritize life.
Yeah.
Because as you said, this wasn't the, there were things that happen, and you can only go through it when no one can tell it to you. You have to experience it. I just preached a sermon topic last Sunday at a different UU church, a Sunday before last. It was based on Carl Jung's. He coined the phrase the first and second halves of life, and he talked about you know the first half of life where we're trying to establish who we are and the mark we want to make in the world, and we want to get the good job and what's my identity. And hopefully if you survive that, if you make it to the second half of life, you start realizing that those things weren't really that important in the first place. I've been through things, I've suffered some things, but you can't get there unless you go through it. And that's what your story reminds me of, because you got to go through some stuff to help you prioritize. Well, we get the phrase now, first world problems. Now we know there's only one world, but that phrase encapsulates, you know, this is just uncomfortable for me. It's inconvenient for me,
Yeah.
but it's not bad. There are people who have it worse than I do.
People would kill to have my set of problems rather than theirs.
Mhm.
Going back, when you first mastered reading as a kid, and of course it comes to all of us at different
Ooh,
points,
I loved it.
what was it that you wanted to get your hands on? What were the subjects that you enjoyed reading most about as a kid that set your imagination in gear, that,
Mhm.
gave you pictures of alternatives for the future, or that you simply just enjoyed?
It was mostly history. I didn't read any science fiction. I read science fiction as an adult, like very recently, within the past 5 years or so.
Yeah.
I loved history. I loved, and that grew into models of human behavior. But I wanted to know about the past so it could help me in the future. And it just cultivated my imagination. But it was something about human history, whether it was military history, obviously it was religious history. It could have been the history of another country. It could have been a different
Yeah.
culture, but it attracted me to it. And it got me going and thinking. And I love words. I love words.
Yeah.
And I got that from my mom. And so literature has always been a great, but I graduated with letters. cum laude. It was something about the spoken and written word, Shakespeare. You're in the theater, that has stuck with me, and it's just rich, and it brings people together, I think, and it takes one out of oneself. Whether it was Melville, whether it was some African American authors, I just love the written word. Oh, I still do.
The first movies that you remember seeing, were you introduced to films with your folks taking you to a local movie theater, or in the world of television, but specifically
Television.
movies?
I was watching, all the cartoons and stuff, but I was watching Westerns. I guess, I was typical teenager watching I Dream of Jeannie, Leave It to Beaver. But I was taken by, Gunsmoke, Ben Carson. He was the Dr. Kildare. I was watching all of that kind of stuff. But I loved, I was fascinated with the Battle of the Little Bighorn. I was fascinated with the Ten Commandments and Yul Brynner, and a movie called The Robe. I watch that even now. It's around Passover and Lent, with Richard Burton as the Roman tribune, who, he had no control of it. The next thing you crucify these couple thieves. One's a religious fanatic, and you move on. I love those kind of stories. That,
Michael,
it was I was seeing different human beings in great situations and not so good situations.
At what point were you looking at it as, where are all the black people? I mean, I like these shows. I'm enjoying it. I understand minority culture in some abstract form, but
I think I think right around the time Martin was killed, my consciousness had raised, and I forget who it was who talked about it. He was a man of color. He said, "Well, I'm watching cowboys and Indians, and I finally got it one day that I was the Indians. I was the Indians. I was rooting for the cowboys." So I would think about then. I think my parents tried to shield us from that as much as they possibly could. But when we came out of the projects, and we were kind of moving up to middle class, you're starting to be in more integrated environments, and you're starting to see, well, I'm being treated a little different here, or I'm being talked to a little different here. And how do my parents used religion to deal with that, because if they didn't, they probably would have wound up hating people in the dominant culture. Now that may be hyperbole, but the religion piece was crucial, because this is not, you can't succumb to that, which also meant a lot of anger was repressed. What do you do with that anger? You take it out on yourself, with the drinking, with the arguing, with the self-destructive behavior. So that's when I really noticed that there was a difference. But yet it did not, as I got older, I found other ways to channel that anger and that energy, but it did not take a hold in me where I could not reach out or be friends. I mean, really vulnerable with people who didn't look like me, the dominant culture, so to speak.
Michael,
it's a great question.
Growing up, as you did in Baltimore, with all that comes with it, your natural being drawn toward religion and looking to have a place in it in your life, your love of acting, which I want to get into shortly. At a certain point, you became aware that certain things that were happening to you might not be happening to other kids, and that ultimately you understood that society saw these as separate outsider events. What was your first awareness of facing off with another intelligence and beginning to understand that you were being interacted with as part of your life.
Well, Kierkegaard, one of my favorite philosophers, said life is lived forward, but it's only understood backwards. And when I was younger, I noticed that I could see things that I thought everybody saw. Like I could always see colors around people. I don't know how I saw it. I didn't know they were auras, but I thought, wow, that person's got a blue. What is that? But I said, I just took it kind of for granted. I noticed that at night, sometimes I wake up in the morning and I'd have little marks on me, but I was like, well, that looks like I dinged myself on something, but no. So I kind of put the thing that got me was I would have blood on my pillow, and I was so I thought that maybe my ear was bleeding, but I couldn't find any blood in my ear, or then I saw it in my nose. But so those were things, but I didn't have a reference point. So I kind of just did not talk about that. As a matter of fact, Peter, you asking that question, when I talk about my contact experiences that started in December of 1989, very rarely do I go back to these were maybe part of the things I was probably having those experiences then. I remember I would see, now I call them orbs, but I could be in my bedroom looking around and I'd see they looked like donuts, but there were circles. They had a little hole in them. And it's like I could see the 3D-ness of my room and they'd just be floating around. They could have been disembodied entities. I don't know what they were, intelligences, but they were like the colors. Some of them were like green. Some of them were purple. Some of them were blue. And they just go, and I'd watch them and then they disappear. And then there'd be one over here and I'm looking at that. I didn't know what they were. I didn't know to ask questions. I didn't know to talk to anybody about it. But as I learned more about the phenomenon and some of the characteristics going back, that, I could look back and say, I was probably being the nosebleeds. Maybe I had an implant, things like that, because I never had nosebleeds. Like I said, I thought it was my ear. So,
Michael, can you date this from a certain time in your life, the earliest that you remember this kind of experience?
What I just explained to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably around 6 or 7.
Okay. Did
Yeah.
you make an effort to try to explain any of this to your folks?
No, I just did not tell them anything like that. No,
Yep.
I didn't even know, I didn't even know I didn't know. I was just, I actually thought people had it. It wasn't until as an adult when I was studying this and trying to find out what was happening to me that people said that they happened to them, and you could trace it back. I had a psychic one time tell me that I've been having these experiences since I was about 7 or 8. And I said, oh my goodness, maybe, that would give a context. But, I just saw, not beings, just energy. And I thought everybody did.
When, if I can ask, did you first start to think about or be interested separately the subject of truly anomalous UFOs, representative of machines of advanced technology and undetermined origin, or UFOs, ethereal beings themselves, or transporters of souls? Or when did the subject generally start to come into your mind? And do you remember what it was that really set you on a course of wanting to learn more about it?
Yes, I do. It was December 28th, 1989, when I had that contact experience. And I remember one of the saving graces was our good brother Barry Downing's book, UFO
Yes.
flying saucers in the Bible. Because it was a minister talking about it, not an experiencer, but that was okay. I just needed something to keep me. Bud had regressed me, but before that, Dr. Gene Mundy. I was having a hard time, Peter, after that, because they kept going on. To this day, I have a hard time being alone it's like post-traumatic stress. Last week, for instance, my wife was out of town. We live in a house now. But, because of those experiences that they can happen so suddenly, it's hard for me. I still sometimes will not turn the light out, like the light's going to keep them from coming until the last minute. I know I'm going to sleep. Let me turn it off. I keep my blinds closed. It's hard for me to sleep with, But that's that 1989. So I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I guess. But that was it. That was it.
Can you describe that experience for viewers who are not familiar with?
Yes, I can describe it. I was scared to death. We had, and prior to this, I mean, I was already leaving the church that I knew of. So it wasn't that I was getting into this, the theology of the Baptist church did not work for me anymore. I'm saved, you're not, that kind of thing. And I had friends, Jewish, gay, Muslim, and it was hard for me to fathom a loving God, barbecuing these people for all eternity. So I was already on that path. I was reading existential philosophy, which was frowned upon in the Baptist tradition.
Highly
frowned upon. But my girlfriend at the time, who later became my first wife, still lives on the Upper West Side. She had the SAD syndrome, seasonal affective disorder. So we had to go somewhere at least once a year. I mean, she would be depressed. And so we would try to go to Puerto Rico, just a weekend, just to get away, to lift her spirits, because New York winters are long, as you know. And we went to Cancun, and we went to the Yucatan. They had a day trip, and we went to see the Mayan pyramids.
Wonderful.
What can you say about that? I mean, it's humbling that the knowledge and that they had then, this civilization. So when we got back home, we got off at JFK. It was cold. She wanted to go home, which we did, to unpack. I was up, energy. I wanted to go. I was invited to a gathering in Hell's Kitchen, down by the Actors Building. You know what I mean.
Ninth Avenue and 42nd.
Yes. So
northwest corner.
Yes. So I went, and I wanted to gloat, man. I was copper red. My hair had changed colors. I wanted to gloat a little bit. And so I did. I went, and no beverages, alcoholic beverages were served, and finger food, deviled eggs. I'm a deviled egg freak, and that kind of thing. So I was starting, I was coming down off the high of that, and I said, I'm going back home. So I caught the subway up, got off, and got off the one train and walked up. And so on 79. And that night, she was already asleep. I walked in, she woke up, I'm home. And I don't know whether I had to get up to go to the bathroom, or I just sensed a presence in the room. But when I turned around, and there was a being at the foot of my bed. I don't want to get up and get it, but I have a statue of what it looked like. That was about 4 feet tall at the foot of my bed. And I felt like my heart was going to come out of my chest. And, the being was there. And he wasn't gray. He had the phenotype of gray. There's so many different types. But I didn't know that then. And he was more off-white. But there was this blue light around him, cobalt blue, wasn't lapis. And around that was this, it was like I was in broad daylight in early morning hours. And he had he had a jumpsuit on that looked like NASCAR.
Hmm.
But it looked like Lost in Space. I'm dating myself, but it would look like Reynolds wrap. It was shiny like Reynolds wrap.
Hmm.
And I thought I was going to have a heart attack. And
Michael, what time of night is this in the morning?
it had to be, I don't remember, but I know I got back from that meeting, that little party. I'm going to say it was like 2 or 3.
Okay. And your wife is out cold. She's sleeping.
She will not wake up.
No,
and it's interesting, but later there's a caveat to it. But I pulled the covers up over my head and I got into the fetal position. I'm sorry. I'm not ashamed.
You're not.
And I heard a sound like I was in the wind. Whoosh, whoosh, and the temperature changed. It shattered reality. I'm on the 15th floor of the Excelsior Hotel, which is still there, mind you. 45 West 81st between Columbus and the Park, across the street from the planetarium. And, I grew a pair, and I finally pulled the covers down, and nobody was there. It's quiet. I woke Sandy up, and I told her what happened. The caveat to this is because I've had other, up until 2019, different races visit, and we can talk about that. But I wanted to get this in before I forget it.
Yeah.
I wrote a book called Initiation, which is it's a book for experiencers. And when I sent her the book, she said, because I put all my experiences in there along with others, she said, I remember that night. She said, I remember it now. She said, I've never seen you so frightened. She said, and I remember there was some there were like other people in the room. She said, but my mind just kept telling me, just go to sleep.
Yeah.
It'll be okay. Just go to sleep.
Classic. Michael, do you remember whether your visceral reaction, to whatever degree you could sort it out, because physiological shock accompanies times like this a lot of the time. Did you have any sense that this was a bad dream, another species, an interdimensional creature, a satanic being, a demon?
No. I didn't think satanic. I didn't think that at all.
Good.
And I knew it was real because I was wide awake.
Yeah.
But it's an important question because, they can manipulate time. And I remember one time I had a dream about them, and they had come into my apartment. And I talked to an old experiencer, and he said, Michael, if they came to visit you in a dream, and everything in your living room or your bedroom was in the exact same place in this dream than it is as it is in waking life, that's not a dream. Because dreams, things are distorted, and there's a different kind of quality. But if they came and got you out of bed, and your closet is right there with the plant, and your clothes were on your chair over there, if that's everything is that way in your dream, that's not a dream, because there are ways that they can meet you out of body too. Yeah.
Michael, at this point, you're a professional actor, but at this point you are already an ordained minister as well. Okay. Yeah. You have now had the kind of experience that does not easily fit into a lot of Christian theologies, and especially for individuals in leadership positions. Once you started to publish around this, and you've been very
Oh,
blunt and literal in the titles of your books. And we're going to get into that kind of beginning awareness and following that ancient alien
mhm.
astronaut trail in a way that's respectful and scholarly, because so dominates pop culture in part since the 60s. That
Yes.
were there other people of the cloth, people of faith, ordained ministers, priests, rabbis,
Mhm.
other religious figures who approached you one way or the other in time to follow and saying, what you're doing is blasphemous, wrong, incorrect, uh, disrespectful,
Yeah. Yeah.
contemptible toward religion?
Yes. There were people who said that. Um, but for the most part, Peter, I kept it to myself. I did
Hmm.
not I was living a double life. And I was going to my support group. You know, Harold Englund, he started Space.
Yeah,
Um, and Bud had his group, which was
yeah,
more people who weren't having, I came out thinking positive about them, even though it was traumatic, because things can be both end. Bud had a different crowd, but we were getting together. So, but I kept it very, very close to the vest
yes.
until the day I met, um, until I read Barry Downing's book.
Ah, that had
That
to be
was
a game changer for you.
it was
Holy
it
moly.
was because he,
It's all there.
my yeah, it's right there. My mind doesn't go to propulsion systems and back engineering. I think it's important. I think it's not the whole story of the phenomenon, but that's important. But when Barry talked about that this has been going on since biblical times, that's all I needed to hear. And so I said, well, if these beings were visiting me in 1989 CE, then they were probably here in 1989 BCE and before. And so I read everything I could on it, um, everything I could around religion and UFOs. And at the same time, I was still having these uh, these visits, but I was given they weren't as traumatic because I knew I wasn't crazy. When Dr. Jean Mundy regressed
Yes,
me
yes,
after I bought, Edith Fiore's book Encounters, and her name was in the back, and then
yes.
Bud and I did the Long Island conference, and he said, I'd like to regress you. So
Yeah.
I was starting to get a handle on things, but I was still having trouble sleeping at night. I was still having visits. So, it was a tough time. Uh, and then I got into therapy for some dysfunctional stuff in my family. And I was brave enough and open enough to talk to this particular therapist about it. And he didn't laugh at me at all. So I
Good.
was starting to get my feet on the ground a bit, but I still wasn't talking about it. I had someone, a publisher, said, "You got to talk about it. You've got to stop it.
Yeah.
People need to hear what's going on, and you need to write. You need to write this." And I did.
When you were doing the reading that ultimately became source material for the books that
Mm-hmm.
you have been
Mm-hmm.
writing, uh, and there are some remarkably fascinating, well-written, brilliantly researched books on
Mm-hmm.
this general subject. A whole lot more books that are a bit more, well, or a lot more superficial, or
Mm-hmm.
more wish driven than evidence driven. But at a certain point, you had to have gone back to scripture, back to the Bible,
Yes.
and
Mm-hmm.
started to reread parts of the Bible you read, were
Yeah.
familiar with, that you held dear, but seeing them in a different way. And I know for me, in my coming and going from the Bible over the decades, more for curiosity on how translations stand up next to each other,
Yes.
especially
Yes.
when
Yes.
the the witness, the person offering the description, is describing something open to the kind of interpretation we're talking about. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, the godmother of them all is Ezekiel. And
Oh, yes.
at one point, it's had to be at least 25 years ago, I had my copy of the Old Testament that I was given when I was bar mitzvahed. I had I think a King James
King James
version
version, yeah.
in the house. But I found from libraries of friends, I had about 6 or 7, basically the same. But I went through Ezekiel in each one, word by word. And I don't have another translation experience like that. Uh, uh, Not a translation, but a treatment experience like that relative to the Bible, because I've never done it with another chapter or what have you. But it so seemed to me that what was going on was a man describing a large metallic thing coming out of the sky,
Yes. Yes.
kicking up all kinds of sand with eyes all about, and of the
Yes.
appearance of burnished beryllium, meaning metal. And it was not ethereal or gossamery. And the being that came out was described as an angel, word that, of course, we're all familiar with. But coming from the original use of the word in Sumerian, it had nothing to do with religion. It meant go-between or emissary.
Mhm, mhm.
And do you remember that experience of rereading some part of the Bible after this change in
Yes.
consciousness and that
Yes.
light bulb going off? And what
Yeah.
might have been that
I
you were
do.
reading?
I was hooked, and it made, again, it brought me. I was more grounded. Ezekiel is, and you brought up a couple things. You brought up Ezekiel, which I want to get into a bit, but you brought up translations, because once you know a little bit of the Hebrew and you know the Mesopotamian text, you realize that these stories are from Mesopotamia. The only difference is that the Mesopotamians didn't talk about a single god. They had no bones that these are beings from the sky. And the word Elohim, which is a masculine plural, that has been mistranslated consciously or unconsciously. And
Wow.
so we're looking at God singular. But going back to Ezekiel, here's a man trying to describe what he's seeing in the language of his day.
Yeah.
And he talks about the craft, of course, the spaceships of Ezekiel, the book written by Joseph Blumrich, who was a
A
NASA
NASA
engineer.
systems engineer.
And he took the metrics that Ezekiel, but what was so significant is that NASA has a patent on the technology that described in great detail in the Bible. The patent number is US 3789947A. It was obtained on February 5th, 1974. And it made me ask, what would NASA need with a patent number from God? So it got me thinking, because it's right there in plain sight, but we weren't taught that way. And if you thought, eyes wide shut. And, there are other ministers who I'm sure they know this or they have questions about it, and other scholars and scientists, but to say it will ruin their careers.
Yeah.
And I say that because I know some people say, well, they're hiding this stuff. Some people may be hiding it, but other people, if they come out, their tenure, their retirement, it's taboo. I'm with the UUs. The UUs don't like me talking. Well, it's far out for them, but I don't talk about it from the pulpit. It's an open secret. They've seen Ancient Aliens. They've seen me on some of these TV shows, so they watch it. But I don't get in the pulpit because it's not my job to force that on them. But I have more leeway.
Yes.
I have more leeway. And every minister, every professor has to gauge for him or herself, how far can I stretch this without endangering my livelihood? And, in my case, I could split my church. Half the church would say Michael's onto something. The other half would say, this is crazy. So why would I do that to myself?
No reason.
Yeah.
It's nice to know that there are people of faith, religious leaders, and you're not the only one. You're one of the most high visibility and vocal.
Yes.
And it's wonderful to know that you exist as part of communities and neighborhoods, because in our lifetimes, the chances are really good that a lot of regular folks who are not ready for this thing called disclosure that we all say we are in our circle of studies and research and contactees and abductees, they're going to need a good listener and somebody who's knowledgeable and who can help them make the transition. And right now, you and I are about to transition into 4 minutes of glorious break. I don't know what you're going to do with your 4 minutes. I think I'm going to watch a movie and have a sandwich. Otherwise, folks, we will see you back here in 4 minutes. Peter Robbins, my special guest, Dr. Michael Carter. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. Don't go away.
Debbie Ziegelmeyer is an experienced diver, dive trainer, and UFO investigator who has researched sites around the world that have water-related UFO activity. We now know that even the Pentagon admits that there are unknown objects in the skies and underwater around the world. Debbie compiled an amazing book to catalog many of these sightings. The Alien Colonization of Earth's Waterways, a reference guide to UFO, USO, water-related activity, has received rave reviews by UFO researchers and the public. The book is available at Amazon.com. Unlock the mysteries of the spirit realm with the new book, Meeting Wallace. In this channeled work by renowned psychic medium Larry Costa, the reader will delve into the profound wisdom of his spirit guide, Wallace. Together, they share the transformative journey of harnessing psychic powers from the celestial plane. Discover the extraordinary psychic gifts that have empowered Larry on his path, and immerse yourself in a thought-provoking and awe-inspiring read. Meeting Wallace is a groundbreaking endeavor, and it is a perspective seen through the eyes of a spirit guide. Discover the wisdom of the spirit realm alongside actual photographs of ghosts and spirit guides. Get the book Meeting Wallace by Larry Costa at Amazon.com.
While most near-death experiencers return to this plane of existence with alluring tales of their time spent in the presence of the divine, what happens when one crosses the veil into the afterlife, into the void? In the new book, Dying to Meet Them, Mindy Toutfest describes her journey to the afterlife after a devastating aneurysm, how a strange turn of events would lead her to spiritual growth, divine healing, UFO experiences, and a greater understanding of the universe. Get your copy of Dying to Meet Them today at Amazon.com or visit unxmedia.com for more information on this book and more amazing selections from UnX Media Publishing at unxmedia.com.
And we are back. Peter Robbins here. Meanwhile, here on Earth, the program, and Dr. Michael Carter, Reverend Michael Carter, has returned for the second hour as well. Michael, I want to pick up back in the past and with a number of images from our large archives of all of the artwork and earthworks that suggest visitations or that people want to believe represent that. This kind of we've seen versions of this, the same configurations suggesting an exotic event going on.
Yes.
In different parts of the world. And of course, yes, people can hit on the exact same idea at the same time, thousands of miles apart, or not. But it is an intriguing collection. And whether or not this can be explained as some ceremonial thing that has nothing to do with operating the controls of a UFO, or allow our imaginations to run wild and think that is exactly what it is. What are your gut thoughts on this series? And there are so many variations on that we're aware of from different cultures around the world.
Yes, I think that, and I feel that, yes, we can explain them away. I've heard people, tell contactees experiences, well, maybe you just have sleep paralysis, and that kind of thing. and yes, that is true, but not everyone. And I think that once, you have to ask yourself. Now I sound like I'm on Ancient Aliens, but you have to ask yourself, why would our ancestors all have similar narratives? Why would they all have the same images in mind? Why would they all talk about, for instance, a reboot after some event that, some extinction event, a flood or what have you? You have to take that. And I think that one of the reasons it's so hard for individuals to accept this is, and Peter, I'm sure you agree with this. Once you come to grips, once you accept the fact, I don't care whether you're a clergy person or not, that we live in a populated universe, you have to rethink God, non-God, who I am, and that's a heavy one. And it's also a frightening one in the sense of, you start to realize that a lot of things that I was taught, maybe all of them, were not true.
Open to question, you bet.
Yes.
One of the things,
I think that's what keeps people from letting it in.
A commonality to so many world religions, so many native traditions, so many ancient, so many prehistoric traditions, is the gods, small g, plural, coming down from the heavens to be amongst us for whatever reason. For me, emblematic of that is this cylinder seal carving from ancient Samaria, about
in Samaria,
500 years old. It's a separate area of wonderful ancient art form in very hard, often gemstone level cylinders of rock. The best engravers would create images. You could roll them into hot wax as you would to seal a letter, which is the origin, the use for a lot of these wonderful carvings. But often it involved more articulated things with wings that were aerial oriented, this being an example.
Yes. Zachariah Sitchin, of course, started us all on this path, being able to read the Sumerian and Mesopotamian tablets. And I believe that our ancestors, when they put wings on these beings and on this technology, they were trying to tell us that these beings flew. It's right there in front of you. Listen, I said this several years ago and someone lit into me about it, and I get it. I'm not saying that there are no such thing as angels. I'm not saying that angels don't have wings. Nowhere in the Bible does it say these beings have wings. Nowhere. And the thing about angels is, Malek in Hebrew, uh, angelos in Greek, is that they are there, but we're never told where they come from. We're never told what they look like. We know that sometimes they're solid. They eat, like in Abraham and Sarah. Abraham feeds them and what have you. But what's so unique about the Mesopotamian, Akkadian, Sumerian, Babylonian narratives is that they don't hold back. They're not saying there's an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. There's not even a word in Hebrew for that. But they make no bones about it, that these beings came from the sky, they interacted with us, they fought each other, they got drunk, they made love, they lusted, they ate. And I think that is, again, the universe. It's a populated universe, and it forces you to say, whoa. What is there God? What if there is? Who? What? When? How? Because these beings are God-like because of their technology. And our ancestors.
The origin of the idea of God creating man in his own image, which, of course, if we're talking even respectfully about that being a perfectly understandable misunderstanding that became codified in Scripture, or that
which is exactly what it was,
went on alongside of these extraterrestrial events. I know, like me, you certainly learned a lot from the writings of Zecharia Sitchin, an antiquarian scholar, Russian Jewish background, who grew up in pre-World War I Palestine, at least came of age there, and went on to become one of the ranking Sumerian scholars, wrote quite a number of books, each one for me fascinating in its own way, but often asking us to take a somewhat greater leap of faith in terms of the symbology or the language. And some of it's pretty controversial, but that initial book, The 12th Planet, I think it's one of the most impacting books I ever read, in part because it explained the origins of certain misunderstandings and the intention to deceive with a twist of language. And then the wonderfully visual Sumerian language, where you can still look at certain word forms or forms that together are a word, and there's a pictograph, an actual image of the simple description that goes with it. And some of them are moving this way with fire coming out the back.
Yes, it's hard. It's very difficult to refute this. And there's a wonderful book. I forget the author. I'm looking at Zecharia Sitchin's work over there. I actually met him in New York at a Burger King for lunch on the Upper West Side. He lived in the upper 80s.
Yes, he actually was a mentor. I was lucky enough to have him as somebody who was a guiding force when I was working on my first book. And he had no specific interest to speak of in the best known UFO case in the UK, but Jennifer Stein, our dear friend who had worked with Zach on certain filmmaking projects and documented him in his work and traveled with him a number of times, she made the introduction. And I think it was very flattering to me, but he invited me to lunch. And part of what we talked about was the Russian Jewish background that we shared. And it was often we would meet at an old cafeteria right in the Rockefeller Center area. And I visited him once at home. And as you can imagine, what an extraordinary, wonderful upper 80s apartment it was. We're going to jump here a bit in that, well, here's an engraving, and it's depicting Ezekiel. It's an 18th century engraving, and it's just one of the many ways that it's depicted. Again, that intriguing use of the words of the wheel within a wheel. One way it could look circular, the way it's written, certain language, it could easily be oval or a disc shape, but here we have it. Now, jumping ahead to the 11th century, even in the darkest dark ages of medieval times in Europe, when pretty much everybody, all things considered, was illiterate or close to it, monasteries, even though the brand of Roman Catholicism at that time was pretty repressive and pretty
brutal
in its own way.
Yeah, brutal.
Monasteries, as we know, often kept the most accurate records of natural and local affairs, historic events of the time, in words and in pictures. And this particular fresco, which is a well-known one to folks like us,
Yes,
appears in the
yes.
sanctuary of a monastery in what would be Yugoslavia in terms of territory. It's again painted in the 10th century, 11th century, and at first look, it's fairly traditional. We've all seen versions of the crucifixion, and this one has a certain style to it. On the upper right, the Meanwhile Here on Earth logo blocks out one detail, but that detail and the one on the far upper left are most intriguing. This is
Yes.
more than 1,000 years ago in a remote, fairly rough culture. Where is this the idea of an allegory of man and a star, or is it something more literal that was so important to the painter? And one would have to deduce so important to the monastery or the leaders or the leader of the monastery, that it was decided that it not only could, but it should be included in this otherwise fairly stereotypical and a masterwork in its own wonderful raw style. But that question for me as an artist, as an investigative writer, as somebody who grew up in the Reformed Jewish tradition and has a fairly open mind on interpretations and can accept that there's sometimes multiple ones, I really like these for what they are, because they make us think and they make us wonder. And yeah.
No, I agree. And there's another point to this as well. I want to just elaborate on for a minute. Again,
Please.
It's the question of a populated universe. The thing is that because one of the questions I get from people of faith who will email me or write, can I still believe in a populated universe, extraterrestrials, ET, and still hold my religious faith? And the answer is unequivocally, of course you can. If you are a Christian and you see that, it does, and you say, oh my goodness, you can believe this and still hold on. If you are Jewish, if you are Buddhist, or you can still keep because early Christianity and early Judaism, before Yahweh became the one, around the 6th or 7th century with King Hezekiah and Josiah, tearing down all the other altars to the other gods, it was not a monotheistic faith. You had different tribes, different people who were worshiping other gods, and then Yahweh comes along and says, "I'm not having it. I don't want you to even depict them."
Yeah.
But Judaism, or primitive Judaism, was not monotheistic. That did not, and neither was Christianity. And we forget that. But that's what's mind-blowing, because again, it comes to, okay, well, our ancestors knew this, then who were they worshiping? Or how were they, we lived in because what we would call it today, Peter, is an invasion. That these beings came, and some of them were in India. We have the Flying Kings and the Vedas. We have Quetzalcoatl and these other folks with the Mayans. The Norse people talk about their stories. We have Africa talking about these beings who come down. And so every continent at the time was carved up, and these beings, they had worshipers, they had followers, they had people who fought for them.
Yeah.
And so when you've been told one thing, but what it does is, Peter, when we realize this, it's a wake-up call, but the moral dilemmas that we have in the Old Testament about how can this loving God, is this the same God Jesus is talking about? He calls Abba and Father. The moral dilemmas go away when we realize that Yahweh was probably one of the Elohim. He was a warrior, and he was a destroyer. And so when he lays waste to someplace like Sodom and Gomorrah, or through these cities, because he did a lot of that, you don't have to go, well, what kind of loving God would commit genocide? You realize, oh, this is not God at all. This is an entity from somewhere else. And so then you don't have to go through that confusion, because most people leave their religion of origins, especially in the West, because they can't reconcile it, because they're told this is a God. But our moral compass says, but how can I worship someone who would do that?
Yeah, exactly what we were talking about earlier. There's a painting. It's a Madonna and Child. As an artist, as somebody that appreciates the skill that goes into great realistic rendering, I'm reminded from my art education and just my interest in the world around me that up until the 1830s or so, if you were a painter, you either painted buildings or you were a painter of pictures. And if you painted pictures, in most parts of the, well, certainly in Europe, most of your painting would be done by commission for people who are wealthier, or for the church, a capital T, capital C. And at the same time, certain painters took it upon themselves, like Frans Hals, the great Dutch populist painter, captured the look of real people, celebrating, working, drinking, eating, sleeping. And this painting comes along. Again, it is it's 16th century.
Yes.
And it captures the imagination of people in the UFO research community, anybody that's interested in the subject. It's been in a museum for several hundred years. And the particular point of interest has never been formally addressed, except to say it's some kind of apparition of the Holy Spirit, and let's move along from there. We see it here to the right of the Madonna's head, and it's in a beautiful Tundo composition in a circle there. And we see it a little larger here. We also see these renditions of the thing. And that's not an angel.
No.
That's not a star or the sun or the moon. That's something that is being observed by that man that we see to the right of the Madonna's shoulder. He was, and I'm speaking here again with all my knowledge and training as a painter, and trying to use my good imagination to push myself back several hundred years and say, I'm out walking my dog, and the dog's in the picture too, and lo, appeareth on the horizon this thing. Well, I'm doing a painting for the church here. I'm just going to put this in because I feel it's that important, or I'm going to risk being judged as a heretic and bring this to the attention, or maybe this was seen by others in this time, and maybe in any case, this artist made a decision. And these things are important in trying to evaluate whether a work is just, oh God, that's just, yeah, I know, I want to believe too, and that could be, but let's move on. Again, the thing itself, this is not a good enlargement, but this is, even if sketchy, it's a structured thing, and it's
Yes.
radiating either actual or allegorical light. And I have to ask myself, what the hell is this? And what's the story with the backstory? Because there's got to be one. That painter, you didn't paint yourself into a painting like this. That would have
Yes.
been considered very audacious, and you might even lose your commission.
Yes.
I-
Or worse. Or worse.
Much worse.
Yes.
This is
Yes.
15th century, and it can be argued that those 7 fully articulated UFO characteristic shapes are decorative, or, when we blow them up, we see angels' faces in them, but worth noting. And same here for me for this German engraving.
Mhm.
No, this one actually is American colonial, that is sometimes confused with the Nuremberg engravings of the 16th century. What are those rod-shaped things? Those Puritan looking people are observing.
Yeah.
And of course, the rods, and we could say they're disc-shaped or orbs, very, very definitely. And one last artifact that I always just find, well, um, quirky and interesting. We have
Ah, yes.
this coin, I believe it's 17th century France, and on the left, we see what many of us would read as a flying saucer, complete with windows.
Yes.
And on the right, a more intriguing rendition with arrows raining down. And that's another thing where I've asked myself, the writing begins at the top with the pluribus.
Mhm.
But if you turn the coin exactly upside down, what you have is perhaps an image of how the local militia responded. Those are arrows heading
Yes.
up
Yes.
toward this unknown, frightening thing.
Yes.
We have no history on this wonderful artifact, but we have it. And a painting that, an adoration painting that I love, that this is a tough one.
Ah, yes. That's by Urt de Gelder, the
Yeah.
Flemish painter. Yes. In the
I've gotten
1600s.
into tangles a few times with people who present themselves as knowledgeable on biblical referential
Mhm.
art, who say that this disc-shaped emblem is an well, for me, it just goes off the track because it does seem to be what it seems to be, a
Yes.
disc shining light down on 2 special people in that moment.
Mhm. Mhm. I agree. I agree. I've heard that tried to be explained away as just an opening in the sky and the sun was shining down. But no, I think that is really what it is. It reminds me of the Star of Bethlehem, because whatever it is,
Yeah,
it's shining a light down on. I think that's called the baptism of Christ. So
I think
there's
so.
Jesus and John the Baptist. But why, if it's the sun or whatever, why isn't the light shining on everybody else? Why are they the special ones?
And
And
that
again,
no
uh,
hole in the sky there.
No, no, but I mean, it's a cognitive dissonance,
Yes.
because if it's what I think it is, then everything I've built my life on, my
Oh,
career,
it's
it
got to
is
be
now,
something else. Yep.
it's shattered. Yes, it's shattered.
Yeah, and that is such an important phrase in looking at this general field. It can't be, therefore it isn't, therefore it has to be something else, which I call the skeptic's mantra. And I
Yes.
remember that moment when I looked up at 14 years old and saw the five silvery white disc-shaped objects that had appeared
Mm,
over my family's house,
mhm.
and looked at them with my sister Helen, and absolutely after X amount of time understood these were from elsewhere.
Yes,
Um, they
yes.
weren't ours. And I knew, in quotes, that flying saucers weren't real because that was the message that I had deduced from the adult world, and I had never had a reason to question it. And the bottom fell out for me in a
Oh,
sense.
yeah.
I experienced, other people put it in different words, but for me, it was a cosmic loneliness. And now, of course, it'd be something you brag about and put on the internet. Um, I couldn't deal with it to such a degree, and some years later went into therapy to deal with the recovered memory, as well as my sister's sharing her some of her abduction-related experiences with me.
Mhm.
These things completely threw my life off track, but that moment of, if this is true and there they are, so it is, everything I thought I knew to this moment is now open to interpretation. You know what?
Everything, everything.
That's completely not okay with me. So
Yeah.
I am now going to do something that I don't even realize I'm going to do. I'm going to repress this memory.
Yes.
And I'll see you in a little over 14 years. Now, what am I thinking about as an adolescent that I want to get started on, especially to keep me focused on other stuff? And it
Mhm.
was a very successful, well,
Yes.
way to travel.
Well, in some ways, your survival depends on it,
Yeah.
because not unless you're just drawn to be the prophet, and it's a lonely life, and
Yeah.
it's not a fun life, and but here we are, vindicated, all these many decades later. I was reading yesterday. I was looking in my library here, and um, I was looking at Flavius Josephus, the historian, and in I think it's chapter 6, book 6, he talks about the fight at Jerusalem, 70 CE, and he says that there were flying armies in the sky that day. Now,
Mm,
I mean, they were in the sky. So that by definition is unidentified and it's flying.
yeah.
But this is in 70 CE at the fall of Jerusalem, when the Romans had taken. And he said, they're flying armies. He said, I heard a loud noise. There was a voice that said something like, we need to get away. So these beings have been here prehistory up until now, and we're just catching up. And of course, we are still trying to get some type of disclosure, but I think it's pretty. A lot of people talk about if they exist. I'm way past that. My point of departure is not, are we alone? My point of departure is, they're here, and how are we going to behave? How are we going to integrate this into our lives?
It's so interesting, Michael, that we're doing this show tonight as an extra kind of point of discussion. Last week, the Pentagon came out with a new report
Mhm.
on UFOs and UAPs. And once again, more than ever, we can rest easy, folks. They're on the case. We know what's going on. And I don't know about you. I sometimes, like you, I love language as a writer and as a reader.
Yes.
And Shakespeare had it all figured out. And the first thing that came into my mind as one news organization or major broadcasting group, BBC, NPR, CNN, the New York Times, Fox, one after another, reporting very dutifully the exact same story. And it's an interesting twist on the old strategy of it's all explainable. In fact, I thought it was very clever, and I don't mean
Yeah.
that necessarily complimentary,
Right.
that rather than, attack the messengers or the old wink, wink, nudge, nudge that worked so well for so many decades of just you take flying saucers and little green men seriously, and it's just code for I'm lonely, I want attention, I'm a con person, I'm a mystic, I'm a goofball, I'm a snake oil salesman,
Yes.
but it can't possibly be what it might be because, well, that's just not the way it is.
Mhm.
And that what they put forward was, there are these courageous whistleblowers who have been coming forward. The best known and most recent in terms of making a splash and getting the respect of many of us is David Gresh. Right background, right guy, and followed by a number of other names that for you and I are pretty distinguished, but saying that they heard something, but it was just a fragment of something else, that there's a certain wish fulfillment, that old X-Files poster of
Yes.
I still
I
want to
want to
believe.
believe. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can be rigorous, but I'm still going to be leaning into my point of view and maybe unconsciously, supporting it in different ways, but that these people are worthy of our respect. And these are perfectly understandable misunderstandings given the complexity of dark projects and things that they were tangentially involved in, and I thought a number of people listening to these reports are going to say, oh, well, I thought that. That's what I always thought. That's what my mom and dad thought. And, what's for dinner, hon? Um,
Yes. Yes.
Other people, I think, will see it for what it is. And it reminded me that the summer of 1997, the 50th anniversary of our
Oh,
modern age of UFOs, Roswell, Kenneth Arnold, the Air Force came out with a book big enough to kill a small animal if it fell off a table. I think it was 500 pages at least.
yeah.
Roswell, case closed.
Yes.
It made a great doorstop. And a lot of it was actually funny if it wasn't so outrageously insulting. And I thought, here we go again. But I was
Mhm.
wondering, what your first thoughts were around this, what we'll laughingly call a development in the story.
Yeah, yeah. I was a little disappointed. I remember talking to a friend of mine in Amsterdam. He's an academic. He's a George Adamski scholar, but he's a retired academic. And he was teasing me. He said, Michael, did you really expect them to come out and say anything else? I said, not really, but I was hoping. But you know what, Peter, I believe that um, the genie's out of the bottle. You can't put it back. Um, when I was younger and a little less, well, I was more self-righteous than I am now, but still, I even get it, Peter, why they're lying. I get it.
I think I do
Uh,
too.
I get it. And you know what I wish we had? I wish we did what South Africa did after apartheid, that we have a truth and
And
reconciliation
reconciliation. Yes.
committee,
Yes.
that we're not gonna, you're gonna get your retirement. Yes, some people died because they knew too much or they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because no president is going to come out on the White House lawn and say, guess what, folks, we've been lying to you for 70 plus years. Some people we even had to exterminate, but no one's going to do that. But if we had a truth and reconciliation committee where
Yes.
people could come clean, because basically a lot of them committed treason. If you signed any type of agreement with
Yeah.
off-world intelligences, if you're exchanging stuff, that's treason, and no one's going to come out and do that. And the mentality is, if I'm a pickpocket, if I go into a party, I don't see people, I just see pickpockets. And so national security stuff is paramount because it's always about that. I personally think the spiritual aspect of this is more important than for all the obvious reasons than for the tech, but I get the tech. But if we had a mechanism where, listen, you don't have to be afraid. What's done is done. The people who are gone, we can't bring them back. But we need to start now.
Yes.
And we need to come clean, or as clean as we can. And there's not going to be any repercussions. But just tell us what, because
Michael,
right now we're asking people who've been lying to us for 70 plus years to disclose stuff to us, and we probably can't really trust what they disclose. So I don't know, I don't have a dog in the hunt as far as if anybody's listening and you have that kind of contact, at least broach that topic, because otherwise this is going to keep going. And the United States we are more secretive, and probably we have reason to be, than any other nation on earth around us.
We started basically the national security state that sadly has captured the reality of other countries as well at this point. And it's interesting you bring up that particular point that you did about something has to be done to allow people to come forward without fear.
Yes.
And my guest last Monday, I'm not sure if you know Joe, great guy, Joe Bookman, who among other things has repeatedly run for Congress, either state or national, for the state of Utah for years on essentially a two-pronged ticket. One that all whistleblowers receive a complete pass on any kind of prosecution on anything even remotely related to what we're talking about. And that the other point of his campaigns have been, we are not alone, and we need to get used to this. I think without some kind of mechanism in Congress, and we're dealing with people here, the ones we're talking about, the ones who have moved the chess pieces around since the get-go here, who we don't elect, who wield power within the intelligence community and military intelligence community that we can sometimes only guess at, some of whom I'm guessing would really be just as happy for this thing to just come to a head and work its way through and let what happens, for goodness sakes.
Yes.
Time to
I think
grow
we
up.
can handle it. We can handle it.
Yeah. But other ones who, they're rooted in such a different way of thinking than we are, different sense of loyalty. And in exploring the origins of UFO ridicule, which I did actively for years, it just fascinates me how it got wired up the way that it did. At the most important subject facing humanity, well, right up there, with climate change and blowing each other to bits, is this question and how best to move forward with it. The idea of whether it could be, I don't know, the United Nations is so tarred in its own problems right now. No world government, I think, is really up for addressing this. But for those who, kind of the spy mentality, who want to just, resist change, to work from, there's only two things going on. I don't have to tell you, in the human universe, we call them different things. There's love and there's fear. There's expansion and contraction. And with this subject, I think those with power to wield, who understand that if it was a worst case scenario, and the ones who are active that we're aware of were evil per se, they could just do some science fiction thing on our heads and we'd be rocking around like people in an old Flash Gordon movie with little brain pans on our head, staring straight away, mining gold and salt.
I think.
Do we come from this? Do we must maintain a aggressive, macho stand against the possibility of alien invasion and fear of the unknown, Or how do we get people at that level of the game, most of whom are tough, armored guys with a lot of power, surrounded by guys like them,
Mhm.
to transform?
Well, that's it's an interesting question. One of the things I wanted to point out that I'm sure the listeners know, and you know, that there is, um, there's an element in our military and in the Pentagon who are fundamentalist Christians, and they
Ooh,
do look at some of these beings as being demons.
a lot of them in
And
the Air
so,
Force.
yeah, and so that has a lot to do with what gets disclosed and what doesn't.
Good
I
point.
want to I want to talk just very quickly
Please.
about Hayam Ashad. I probably tore his name to pieces just before Christmas 2020. He's not the only one, obviously, but Brigadier General Hayam Ashad. He for 27 years he was Israel's chief of space security.
Yes.
And he had come out and said that that we were already in contact, Israel and the United States, for 70 plus years with off-world intelligences. Now, if you do the math, that takes us right back to Truman and Eisenhower
And,
administrations.
and the
He,
origins of Israel.
yes, he says that there is a galactic federation, that there is a galactic federation, and but what he said was that there are also some extraterrestrial races who do not want disclosure. Obviously, Paul Hellyer talked about this. The late Edgar Mitchell, proponents of, listen, we need to make this, we need to democratize this information. But thinking about Brother Ashad, so we're thinking that it's maybe it's a level of government, and then there's some elite people over that. But now when he comes out and says there's some extra, and he said until humanity knew what space really was,
Yeah.
which is an interesting phrase, that some of these beings were like, they're not ready yet. And so we don't know what treaties have been signed outside of the Grenada, Eisenhower. We don't know any of that. But when he says that, then we have to also know that there's also there's some otherworldly forces that are saying, don't tell them yet either.
I think for me,
I'm not trying to let anybody off the hook,
yeah,
but I'm saying the rabbit hole is deeper than just what we think it is.
of course. I obviously part of the history, the legend, the myth of ufology, for lack of a better term, is the treaty or treaties that
Mm-hmm.
the Eisenhower administration signed with non-human intelligences.
Mm-hmm.
I've read some of the material on it. I've looked into it on my own. I had Paul Blake Smith, one of the
Yes,
best-known
I'm
writers
familiar with
on the
him. Yes.
subject, on the show to present his point of view. For me, it may or may not be true, but I've never seen anything that has convinced me that this is an empirical fact. And dear Bud Hopkins, a friend of both of ours and mentor
Yes.
for me, and who I worked for so many years, Bud's basic point of view on it was they don't need to sign a blanking treaty with anyone. And I tend to agree with that. I know the basic understanding of the story that's most popular, or the
Right.
reality,
Right.
if it's true, is that the government, traded them. They
Yes.
can freely abduct people when they want to, and we get
Yes.
technology. Well, they can freely abduct people when they want to anyway. And yes, we've gotten some technology, either directly or indirectly, it seems. But I don't see that as empirical fact yet.
Sure.
At the same time, we can only imagine thinking the way they think. The great late Margaret Mead, one of the most influential and famous anthropologists in American history, who was head of anthropology studies at the great American Museum of Modern Art in New York for many years. During her life, she was asked her opinions on visitations, extraterrestrials. I don't
Wow.
remember the exact quote, but she began it by saying, I have no idea because I don't think like them, but the best I can do is think like an anthropologist. And if I'm, in an area exploring a new part of the universe here on Earth, and, we part the reeds, and there in the valley is that pre-Stone Age tribe. No air route has ever gone over it. No other person from
Mhm.
has ever penetrated it, and they're living as they have for the last 50 or 100,000 years. My passion is going to be study it, watch it, learn from it, film it, document it until you find gold or oil, and then all bets are off, and good luck, because
Yeah.
your civilization
Yeah.
is about to take a hit.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. I look at it this way. Let's say that the Grenada Treaty didn't happen, or has not happened. My point being is that people like, I was a little leery of Elizondo, and I was, but people like Edgar Mitchell's, and people like Grush, and people like
yeah,
Hayam Mashad, people like Putin's right hand man Medvedev, who said on a hot mic that that every new prime minister of Russia gets a dossier of all the extraterrestrial civil. They have no reason to lie. To me, this is disclosure. It may not be disclosure that the way we want it,
yeah,
that someone's going to come out. But when you hear these things, and no one silenced Medvedev, no one silenced Hiram
yeah.
Mashad, no one silenced, what's the guy who used to be head of French intelligence? His last name is Juliet. He came out and said that we were, and ne'er a dog barked. So if these people who have no reason to lie,
Yeah.
who are making these statements for whatever reason, they're not being reprimanded, they're not being punished, they're not being medicated. We're being told from these high echelon people in governments that there is a galactic council, this has been going on for 70 plus years. We need to be listening to that.
Michael, a question for you.
Yeah.
In the world of UFO related human affairs, we have so many dedicated, interesting, different people. There's no mechanism by which to govern them. If we were doctors or lawyers,
Mhm.
and we presented faulty research, or we presented our beliefs as fact in some way to our
Mhm.
colleagues, the equivalent of the AMA or the American Bar Society would yank our licenses to practice UFO
Yes.
studies. We
Yes.
are an unregulated industry.
Yes.
And so anybody can say, that's what I know is going on, prove me wrong.
Mhm.
And you're hard pressed. Two general factions have emerged over the decades.
Mhm.
And I think because we tend to think linearly, and we have the need of you're right, you're wrong, as opposed to you guys are different. Um, we're faced with a situation where we now have thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not some, maybe even several 100,000 people in the general American population of over 300 million people who are to some degree public with their non-standard, paranormal, truly anomalous experiences involving UFOs. Uh, it can be just with their friends or family, or as well known as, say, a Travis Walton. Um, People, as we keep coming and going from, report all kinds of experiences.
Yes.
And the work that you've been doing with Free, and Ray's wonderful work there for years,
Mhm.
he's been so dedicated. And all of the reports that you've gotten from people around the world, ones that have been checked out, of people who have no particular agenda here, like any of us
Right.
should,
Yes.
who report positive experiences, learning experiences,
Mhm.
beatific, transcendent, transformational experiences, where other people report scary ones.
Mhm.
depressing ones, challenging ones that are terrifying. One can argue, in part, it's your attitude. You know, if you
Yeah.
were more welcoming and loving, you wouldn't be so freaked out. Well, maybe
Right.
so. Or,
Yeah.
they're the bad ones who, were famous in that wonderful episode of Twilight Zone of It's a Cookbook. And they
Yes.
just
Yes.
kind of refined their act. And yeah, welcome the Space Brothers. Do you feel, first of all, it it occasionally is challenging to deal with people who feel that you're wrong if you adhere to, support, or continue to um, put forward the idea that you're bad for our publicity, or
Mhm.
your aliens aren't telling you the truth,
Mhm.
or when number one, we're all in it together, like all human experiences. It's the subjectivity is mixed in with the objectivity,
Yes.
that we're dealing with other intelligences, plural, some of whom may have very different ideas about us. Obviously, some who do seem somewhat at least sentimental about us and don't want us to die off. Um, Others who, that's not a bad idea. We are the ones we warned us of. We are the infestation. We are the
Mhm.
cosmic fleas on the back of the great cosmic dog.
Yes.
We're the problem here.
Mhm.
We're coming into our last couple of minutes. In summing up some of the bigger thoughts here, and you will be back, as Arnold Schwarzenegger said. Um,
I love to come here, Peter.
it's always great
And I
coming
mean,
on
just
the
your
show.
questions. I mean, because we talk about life, we're just not. But okay, this is why, because yeah, I'm wasting my time. I know we got a couple minutes. From my research, Peter, and even from my experiences, I believe that just like human beings, but if we look at the narratives from whether it's South Africa, whether it's from First Nations people, whether it's biblical, there are beings here. Some of them will come to help us. You pick up the Bible. Some of them come to help. They have messages, and some of them could care less. Some of them were just here for our resources.
Yeah.
Some of them, you know what I mean? Or they want to keep us so naked we don't so subservient we don't even know we're naked, like in the Garden of Eden. And I think that's what we have to hold um, in to focus on. That these beings are flesh and blood. They do die after long periods of time.
Mm,
Because the narratives are there. We look at the Greek, the Titan. They're called Titans there. The Nephilim, the Anunnaki. These giants. Again, they drink. They make love. They war. They fight. They love. They come and help. Some of them come and help. Show us how to make beer. Show us what crops are good for, to survive. What plants are good. What plants aren't good. And so I think we have to keep that balanced view. What confuses it, at least in Western culture, is okay, then where's God in all this? And I don't know the answer to that. I think the beauty of that is that we get to experience that for ourselves. You don't need a priest and a mom, a rabbi, you know, to tell you, because you will experience it.
yeah.
But I think that we have friends, and I think that we have people who could give a you know what, and I think that we have some beings who are just neutral. But that's what happens when we live in a populated universe, and it changes the whole paradigm.
Michael, where can people find your books? And I'm going to show some of the
Oh,
covers of some.
yes, I can be. The books can be found on Amazon.com or Barnes and Nobles. Just type in Reverend Michael J.S. Carter. My newest book is called Enlightenment. It's a collection of sermons. You can email me at michaeljscarter.com. My fan page on Facebook is Reverend Michael J. Carter. I will answer you. I will get back to you, and let's have a conversation. And it's always a pleasure to be here, Peter. Always, always.
Michael, truly. And I
Oh,
send you and your family a lot of love. We're almost at the springtime. maybe this year will be the year that our friendship goes from being analog to three-dimensional and corporeal. One
I
can
would
hope.
love it. I would love it, brother. I would love it. Next time I'm there, I'll give you a holler.
Peter Robbins here. Meanwhile, Here on Earth is the show. Dr. Michael J. Carter. Reverend Carter, thank you so much for your time.
My brother,
Big hug.
Peter. Yes,
And
and
much love.
listen, just be safe up there.
Will do.
Be
You as
safe.
well.
All right. Blessings.